Hello, I am just planting up the rest of this herb garden and finishing it off with some thymes. It's a very autumnal garden as well today, here at Powderham Castle. You can really feel the seasons shifting. And 3 weeks ago I started this, so it's a lovely feeling to be finishing it. The rest of the garden is all straight lines, but this is sort of a spiral arrangement of thymes, which is a very traditional way of planting up a herb garden. I've got about 3 of each. This one here is creeping red, and it just gives different colours through the year as they flower and different flavours as you're harvesting it. So this should be really beautiful, really low to the ground and full of evergreen leaves of different colours. There's variegated ones and green ones, and it will look really beautiful. Now there is lots to come on today's programme. Rachel is discovering the ingenious ways in which flowers attract a host of pollinating insects.
So we've got this flower here, and oh my gosh, okay, so we've actually got the bee visiting, and you can see that this is exactly what the flower designed it to pick up that pollen.
We meet an expert who uncovers the mysteries of a universe hidden beneath our feet.
When I talk about the power of soil, you would not believe the life in this teaspoon. Thousands of species.
Carol is busy collecting seeds to make even more plants for free.
All around the garden, seed heads have been swelling and ripening, and I've been keeping a really, really careful eye on them.
And I will be sowing some seeds ready for next year and possibly dodging some showers, I think. If, like me, you're a person who slightly struggles going into autumn because it's dark and all that stuff, then I highly recommend planting bulbs. It is my favourite thing to do because it always feels like you're burying something very magical, which you forget all about, and then in the spring they come up, and there is nothing better than that hopeful first sight of a bulb growing through the soil. So here, where there's a few gaps, I'm going to put some big clumps of tulips, and I've got some Dutch iris as well, and I'm going to really cram these in. Now for me, especially in a garden like this, I plant tulips that I want to come back each year, and this one is called Ballerina, and Ballerina will come back quite reliably year after year, but also it's really highly scented, which is very unusual for a tulip. You can always tell a tulip bulb because it has quite a shiny brown covering, and the flat bit is the root plate, and the spiky bit at the top is where the shoots will come. So if you're doing them individually, I'd suggest planting them the right way up. About 3 times the depth of the bulb is generally a good rule, but I am just gonna pour them in. Spread them out a bit, but that's a nice natural looking clump, and they'll be beautiful. Another favourite bulb is Dutch iris. Now, Dutch iris have quite tall stems and really beautiful, bright flowers. And I'm just going to put a mix of different colours in. A really spectacular bulb, and they're used a lot in cut flowers. And I'm sort of planting them in the same method that you would for cut flowers. Really cram them in. Again, about 3 times the depth of the bulb. Now, these will flower about May or probably June time, depending on where you are. And they last for ages in a vase. There you go. So, again, the same method. There we go. For the front edge, I am using the tulip, Preston's Shogun, and it's got lovely little orange flowers on multiple flower heads, also fragrant, and it will naturalise, it will form little clumps. and it will be very, very happy in the front of a border, as long as it's not too wet. That's the one thing they don't like, is to sit in water. Because they will bulk up a little bit more, I'm going to spread them a little bit more thinly. There, so again, pointy side at the top, flat side at the bottom, and I will place these. These tulips will flower a lot earlier than the irises, so about March or April time, and that gives a fantastic succession of colour here in the border, but also it provides really valuable nectar to all the visiting insects that will visit this garden in the spring. Now this year, Rachel has been completely immersing herself in the whole world of pollinators.
It's been a fascinating few months discovering some of the amazing adaptations plants have made to pull in pollinating insects.
That's incredible.
Like finding some flower petals are hotter than their leaves to help warm up cold-blooded insects.
The temperature acts both as a reward, somewhere warm to sit, the nectar gets warmer, like having a nice hot cup of tea on a cold day.
And learning that some flowers keep pollinators loyal by showing when individual blooms have run out of nectar.
It goes from yellow to pink after pollination. It means the pollinators don't waste time. There's no nectar in there and they don't need pollinating. It's coding, basically. So,
Very
yeah.
clear instructions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And discovering that flowers like this rose have tiny cells on their petals to help pollinators clamber around them.
That conical shaped cell is actually about the same size as an insect foot. So it's almost like a climbing wall on flowers.
That is extraordinary.
But as gardeners, we know that all those precious pollinating insects, lured in so cleverly by the flowers, really need our help these days. As a vital part of our planet and our food chain, their numbers are in rapid decline. But there is hope.
Research has shown that our gardens already provide a vital source of food and nesting sites for all sorts of wildlife. So we gardeners are already making a positive difference. And having seen and heard so many more insects in my own garden when I started really planting to attract pollinators, I know how much joy that can bring.
Helen Bostock is a pollinator expert for the RHS, so she knows about insects and what they need to thrive in our gardens.
So when we talk about pollinators, who exactly are we referring to? We've got bees, we've got butterflies, we've maybe got hoverflies, but what people might be surprised to learn is that we've got over 1,500 species of pollinating insect in the UK, and that's a huge diversity. You've got to include the solitary bees, the wasps, you've got beetles, you've got plant bugs, you've got the nighttime pollinators such as the moths. So it's really huge. Should we have a little wander around and see what we come across?
Research has found there's at least half a dozen species of bumblebee and more than a dozen solitary bees in the average town garden for starters. And in these lovely borders, there'll very likely be more. But all pollinators need pollen and nectar to feed themselves and their young. And crucially, these insects vary enormously in size and have different length tongues.
How important is it to grow a real diversity of different plants in order to encourage lots of types of pollinator?
Yeah, so that's the real nub of it, that if you want to attract that diversity of pollinating insects, you need to have a really big range of flowers. So what's great here about this border is that we've got things like this salvia just in front of us that has this sort of long tubular with these sort of lips at the front. So it needs a slightly longer tongued bee or other insect that can get in there. Right next to it, we've got this sedum or Hylotelephium, which has a much, much flatter, more open, accessible platform. I mean, the whole flower head is like a table of goodies for the insects. I mean, it's absolutely covered in honeybees today, but you can see a few bumblebees on there as well.
And what about the daisy shapes, like the Helenium?
Members of the daisy family have got not just a single flower, but actually it's packed full of multiple flowers in a single head. So that's a huge delivery system of pollen and nectar. Some might attract the smaller solitary bees, some might be more attractive to flies. Go and have a look, actually, you know, be curious about what it is that's visiting your flowers.
What this shows really is that this area is about the size of a small garden. So look how many different types of plants and flower shapes you can get into here.
You don't need a big space. Little square of this in any garden and you're going to have this sort of range of insects to attract.
Really inspiring.
As flowers come in such a range of shape and depth, it's really useful to investigate exactly where the nectar is in each one, because looks can be deceptive.
Can we have a look at this dahlia then and just see close up?
Let's just carefully pick this one off.
Right.
So we've got this flower here and oh my gosh, okay, so we've actually got the bee visiting and you can see that this is exactly what the flower designed it to be, which is to encourage that bee to get right, its whole face right into the heart of the plant to pick up that pollen. So yeah, that's a real demonstration. So if I just get in there and brutally pull this poor old flower apart, there we go.
Right.
So actually now we're seeing the hidden depths of the flower. And if you see this sort of red section, actually at the base of that is where the plant has its nectaries. And those nectaries, they're the area in the flower that produces this sugar-rich nectar. But of course, that's several millimetres long. And so it's going to be only insects with that longer tongue that can get to it. So actually, we can already tell that from what's visiting. The vast majority of the insects on here are bumblebees. And although you have both long and short-tongued bumblebees, they're the ones that are going to be able to actually get into that.
It is astonishing, isn't it, how closely they're dependent on one another to ensure that pollination. I find the whole thing mind-blowing.
In contrast, the open-shaped flower of this geranium is very shallow. It's why it's popular with smaller pollinators like hoverflies. But looking closely at this garden, there are some special visitors.
Look there, a carder bee?
Yes, that's the common carder. So it is another type of bumblebee, a little bit smaller, that all ginger body. You haven't got the stripes that you've got in some of the other bumblebees. But what's lovely about the common carder is that word carder actually comes from the sort of carding of like wool.
Of wool, yes, pulling it.
And it refers with these bees to where they prefer to nest. So if you've got a patch of lawn and can leave a little bit of grass to grow long, the base of that long grass has this straw-like material in, and that's perfect for common carder bees. The females make this sort of little pocket of a nest at the base of long grass. So just leave that through the summer, that patch, so that they've got opportunity.
As all of these pollinators need homes and breeding grounds, putting up solitary bee houses and bee boxes, leaving long grass, and big logs with old beetle holes will all be very welcomed. And with flowers for as much of the year as possible, they'll be even happier.
Most of the bees surrounding me, and there are plenty of them, are going to spend their short lifespans probably in the close vicinity of this garden. And if the garden provides everything that they need in terms of forage and shelter, then why would they go anywhere else? And that's how I feel in my own garden, a real connection with the bees that I know I've planted for, so that they keep coming. And they bring me complete and utter joy.
Go on then, on your bed. Good boy. Right. Now this bed is empty and ready to be put away for the winter. But before that happens, I wanted to talk about weeds. And essentially a weed is just any plant that's in the wrong place that you don't want. So here are a few. What we've got in this bed is lots of seedlings and young plants. Lots of them are thistles. So if I just dig a couple up, now they are quite easy to get out. They look quite different, but they both have this very, very deep taproot. Now that's a really important part of the anatomy of these weeds. The taproot allows them to take quickly into the ground, get nutrients that they need and hold on. Often with deep taprooted plants, they will bring up nutrients from deeper in the soil and make them available at the surface. So this will colonise waste ground and improve the soil for other plants. These are annual weeds, so not a huge problem. You could just hoe them and leave them on the surface where they will break down and go to feed the soil. But there are plants with very deep taproots that can be more problematic, and they are perennial, which means they come back year after year. So if you don't get rid of them one year, you'll have the same plant coming back, and you need to get rid of the entire plant, including its very, very deep taproot. And this is a dock. You can see the size of this taproot, and it's not a particularly old plant. So eventually this root would go through the topsoil into the subsoil and bring nutrients up from there. This is particularly good at bringing up things like phosphate and potassium. The problem with perennial weeds like this is that even if you hoe them, it doesn't kill them. You really need to remove this whole root to get rid of the problem. And I wouldn't put it on the compost heap, I would put it on the ground because it will just continue to grow if you try and compost this. On the pathway, if you drop perennial weeds, they tend not to grow back because you've got compacted ground, not nice soil, they'll bake in the sun and you'll walk on them, so they actually act as a really good alternative to wood chip. Right, but not all weeds have deep taproots. Some of them have other kinds. This is a very common weed, this is spurge, an annual. This one is actually a euphorbia. So it's our native euphorbia, which is a kind of ornamental plant that we often grow in shady areas in gardens. But the key identifying feature with spurge is if you snap this stem, you can see immediately white latex sap comes up. This sap, if you get it on your skin and then the sun comes out, which seems unlikely at this point, but maybe will happen, can really cause blistering. I had it once on my ear and it lasted for months when I was weeding around euphorbias, so be really careful of that. Just here, there is a stinging nettle, which I'm going to dig out with my bare hands. I don't actually mind getting stung, it helps build histamine, so it's good for allergies. This is a perennial stinging nettle. Urtica doica is the Latin name for it. And this is a young seedling because it hasn't yet formed very strong yellow roots. But when it gets bigger or older, a mat of surface roots will form. And traditionally they would have been used in making cordage, so ropes. They're a really functional plant, really delicious, really full of nutrient. They're really good in nettle soup. Usually you stop picking them at about May time. Let them go to seed. The seeds are also edible. And they're really, really good food plant for a lot of butterfly species, caterpillars. So in terms of ecological function, they're a really, really, really good plant. In terms of growing in the middle of your veg bed, they're not necessarily what you want because they will probably spread quite quickly and outcompete a lot of the vegetables. Unless, of course, it's this you're going to eat. Again, I wouldn't compost it. I would put it on the pathway and let it dry out. Over here, there's another nettle called a red dead nettle, although it's completely unrelated to stinging nettle. And this is a lamium. People tend to love this because it's really, really good for wildlife. Famously fantastic for pollinators. So calling it a weed is a bit of a stretch actually, because it's really encouraged. Now, you can identify this because of its pink flowers, which are sort of like pea flowers. So it does look a little bit like nettle leaves, but these are much downier and softer. It's really, really a lovely plant actually. but I feel a bit bad digging it up. It's not wanted here though. And the last weed that I know Jeanette's having real problems with in this garden at the moment is oxalis. And there are two forms here. There's a large-leafed oxalis. This one has pink flowers. And there's also a much smaller one here which has got yellow flowers. But they do the same thing and they form a mat on the floor. This one has at the base a little mass of bulbils which will keep growing. So if you don't get all of that out, they'll come back again and again. Now, Jeanette has all sorts of different ways that she copes with different weeds and preps her beds ready for the winter. Hello.
Hi.
You're putting cardboard down. I remember you used to, but you said you were going to stop.
I know. Well, the first time I used cardboard, it worked really well for a year, but there were lots of docks that I covered up.
Right.
And believed that the cardboard would actually get rid of them forever.
Right.
And after a couple of seasons, the docks started coming back through.
Right, I see.
But that was only one layer of cardboard.
Okay.
This is 4.
But you've cleared docks from this area anyway, haven't you?
I have, but it's not to say that they're never going to come back.
So this is sort of a different function now, really. Rather than mulching with cardboard to get rid of weeds, you're mulching with cardboard to keep all the goodness in the soil that you've already now been working on for years.
And protect the soil over winter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I suppose you need the soil to be as healthy as it can be because you're a community market garden.
That's absolutely right. We need to make sure that we can get as much crop as possible out of our soil. And so by looking after it and doing this, we just get the benefit from it. Sage Green Growing has been going for 5 years now, and we've relied on funding and the goodwill of our volunteers and their hard work. But we want to be more sustainable and be able to look after ourselves, and the veg we grow is going to help us do that.
Is this the way you were growing your green manures this year?
Yes. I trialled white clover underneath courgettes, just on this one bed. And there was a marked difference in the courgettes and what we harvested as well, in comparison to the other rows behind.
Well, just this row was the best performing?
This was the best. The plants were huge, head and shoulders above what we got behind.
Really?
Yeah.
But you're no dig here. So is that partly why you're covering it rather than digging it into the ground?
Yeah. I'm just going to let nature take its course. The worms are going to have a great winter. And it's going to be absolutely perfect here for the spring.
Lovely.
Talking about winter, it's a bit nippy, isn't it? Shall I go and light the fire?
Oh, good plan.
Okay.
Good timing as well. I'll let you crack on. I know it's the plants that we gardeners all love, but without the soil, they simply wouldn't grow. To investigate soil health on a microscopic scale, we visited Eddie Bailey in his garden in Wiltshire.
Soil is the most diverse and abundant ecosystem on the planet, and it supports every living organism. There is more life in the soil than there is in the tropical rainforests or in the Great Barrier Reefs of Australia. It's the most incredible, powerful material on this planet. Oh, that is beautiful. I've been gardening organically for over 30 years. I grow the normal range of vegetables and flowers, but for the first 20 of those years, I was digging and rotivating. And the germination rates were slowly diminishing, the health of the plants was diminishing. So as a geologist and soil specialist, I got down on my hands and knees with my magnifying glass and looked a little bit more closely at the soil to work out what was going wrong. And it was the digging, so I stopped. The soil microorganisms have evolved over billions of years. They practically invented plants, and they jumped on board inside and outside of those plants, and they've been growing plants healthily for 410 million years. So my job as a gardener is to create the environment that allows them to do what they do best. Talk about the power of soil. You would not believe the life in this teaspoon. That teaspoon of soil, well, that's what we're looking at here under the microscope. All these tiny dots jiggling about. That's all the bacteriums, thousands of species. So I describe the diversity of life in a healthy soil as the soil Serengeti. You have the herbivores. In the soil, these would represent the bacteria. And the bacteria are like the bottom of the food chain. They're like the zebra and the wildebeest that everybody else eats. The protozoans are like the leopards. Protozoans are very tiny single-celled organisms that are like nothing better than to chow down on the bacteria. Go up another level, lions. In the soil, those guys would be represented by the nematodes. The nematodes, they are munching through some 10,000 bacteriums every hour. There is just so much life going on in that tiny teaspoon of soil. So growing healthy vegetables and fruit and resilient flowers, I mean, it starts here. This is where the magic happens. This is the compost station, because a good quality homemade compost has got to have all the microorganisms in it. If it hasn't got microorganisms in it, then to me it's just organic matter. And wood chip, for me, is one of the most important ingredients. Wood chip adds carbon, but also wood chip adds structure. So to balance the wood chip, I add meadow hay. It might look brown, but it's actually green. All that's happened is I've just dried it out, but that's full of nitrogen. Other greens include normal garden shreddings, lawn clippings, and the contents of your compost caddy. Now this is ultimately what you want to end up with. This is absolutely brimming with life. This feels light, it feels cool, feels very moist. Ooh, and that smells divine. If you don't have an allotment or even a garden, and you're growing out of window boxes or indoor houseplants, you can still get the biology working for you. You just need a few simple ingredients. This is a basic shop-bought compost. I can assure you there's very limited biology in it. So we need to introduce that biology. So I've just made up a little posy here of compost caddy materials. I've got my tea bags, got some grass clippings, a few little wood chippings, all the food that the biology wants to start. I'm now going to add my secret ingredients, biologically rich compost. Now, if you haven't got biologically rich compost, just go to any garden that's got a little bit of soil with worms in it, and I guarantee it'll have microorganisms in it. And then tuck your posy into the end of your window box, keep it moist, and after a few days you can take that posy out and spread that biology across the rest of your window box. Really couldn't be any simpler. You don't need to know what they're doing, just that they are doing it, and you just create the habitat. So You don't dig the soil, you don't turn their house upside down, you don't put chemicals down, but it is a habitat and it needs feeding. It needs feeding with just a good quality homemade compost, and really important, it needs water. So I've put about 1 kilo of really good biologically rich compost into a mesh bag, and I'm going to give it a really good stir. So I'm extracting the microorganisms off the organic matter, and this can go back on the compost heap. The health of your soil could not be more important for the health of your plants and for the health of us. We've been damaging the soil for centuries. We didn't know how important the biology was until we looked down a microscope. Whether you're growing fruit, flowers, vegetables, it doesn't matter. The common denominator is a healthy soil.
Compost is absolutely one of the most important parts of the garden, and if you really know how to make it, it can change the way that you grow. So it's so useful to hear that. Right, what I'm doing now is making a lovely cup of very autumnal tea with rose hips and a little bit of the last of the mint, making the use of the fire that Jeanette put on. Roses are the same family as things like apples and pears, but they're really, really tasty and they're very good for you. Rose hips particularly are full of vitamin C. So very healthy, very good for fighting off things like coughs and colds, boosting a bit of your immunity. Rose hips contain seeds that are covered in tiny hairs, which are a real irritant. They used to make itching powder from it. That's why I'm not really cutting too far in, just a little bit to expose some of that flesh and allow it to let out its goodness into the tea. Come on then. There. Still to come on today's programme. Carol concludes her mission to create plants for free as she explores the borders in search of seeds.
Can you actually see those 3 seeds in there, all in a line, and all protected by this lovely dry, silvery coat? Aren't they gorgeous? Isn't nature wonderful?
When I was picking my rose hips, I noticed something very interesting about this rose that I wasn't expecting. And it's something that happens all of the time, especially when you inherit a rose. You may not notice, but actually it stopped being the rose it was supposed to be, and it started to be the rootstock. And that's what's happened here. If you look down here, you'll see there's about 3 branches of a cultivated rose in amongst all of this growth. What's happened here is that the rootstock, Rosa canina, dog rose, has actually taken over. You can really identify the original cultivated rose here by looking at the stem. You can see it's absolutely covered in thorns, and also the leaves are quite dull with quite heavy veining on them. Now that differs a lot from the rootstock rose, which has got quite smooth green stems when it's young and vigorous. And then the older stems, they're a bit thicker and browner and has much smaller, neater leaves almost, with less clear veining. So all this will need to be cut right back down to the ground to let the true rose show itself and get more vigour. But it's still early autumn, and with so much growth still happening on the plant, that would probably shock the rose too much. Instead, that is much better done when it is fully dormant. Instead, what I'm going to do now is just remove the whippy growth along here, because this will catch the wind, especially as the autumn progresses and winter storms hit, and that will cause these stems to rock and cause something called wind rock. That's when the roots just under the surface of the soil break and snap as the whole plant moves, and it's very, very damaging to roses. Take off anything like this that has a lot of potential to catch the wind and take it back to a bud. It's always best practice, even if you are planning on removing the rest of the plant later, even if it's just in a couple of months. Because just in case something happened, I got too busy, I forgot to come back, you would still then have a healthy plant. And in fact, with roses generally, I always say, look more than you cut. Really go all around the rose, look for crossing stems, look for disease, work out exactly where you're going to make your cuts before you do it. So you spend more time looking than you actually do cutting. That's really reduced now, but I'm not going to waste any of this because although it may not be the rose that's desired here, it's still a lovely one. Right. Now, with what is left over from my prunings, I am going to take some hardwood cuttings. Now, this can be done all the way through the winter, and the idea is that the wood has gone hard because it's had a whole season to develop. And it's a really, really easy way of taking cuttings of all sorts of shrubby materials. You could do it with hazels or with elders as well. So I'm actually using garden soil for this rather than compost. And that's because often if you were taking hardwood cuttings, you'd actually put them in a trench. So dig a little trench in the garden, stick the cuttings in and just leave it for the winter. But there's no room here to do that because all the ground is needed for vegetables. Now, when a stem is hard like these, they take a bit longer to produce roots. But that's okay, because it means that once they've got their roots on, they've been in the pot for a while, they're nice and strong, and they should establish pretty quickly. So all you're doing is you're looking for nice, thick, healthy, disease-free stems with no damage on them. And the key to doing this is clean secateurs and then a straight cut just below a node or a leaf joint at the bottom, because that's where all the hormone is that goes on to change the cells from stem cells into root cells. And then just above a node at the top with a slanted cut. And that will hopefully then be your growing tip. Now, the reason that I always do a straight cut at the bottom and a slanted cut at the top is I always know what the bottom is and what the top is then, because if I put it in upside down, it won't grow. Now, I'm just going to take that off and turn it into a dibber. Make a hole along the side where the pot will warm up, and then push this in so you have at least 2 nodes under the soil and 2 nodes above the soil. With that slanted cut on top, it's going to stop water from sitting on the top of the cutting, and that can get fungus in and begin to rot. And you might wonder why I'm doing this with a rose that I wanted to remove from the border. But the reality is, even though it's not the perfect rose for the border, it's an absolutely lovely rose. It's one of our native roses, Rosa canina, and it's really good for wildlife. Rose hips will stay on all through the winter and give the birds something to eat. But also they're host to all sorts of other creatures like the rose gall wasp, and you'll see their little galls of very, very spiky pink balls along the stems. But also bees in the summer will love the flowers. There. It can stay outside, that's really important, so that it slowly puts on root growth rather than too quickly. Then it will be strong by the time they're ready. And that will be at the end of winter maybe, but actually with something like this, I would probably leave it for a whole year. As long as you keep them well watered, they should put on really good growth. So that by this time next year, I'll have really strong plants that I've got for absolutely nothing because I'm using garden soil, reusing pots, and this is just waste material that would have gone on the compost anyway. So it's always worth giving things a go, even if you won't have 100% success with them. But I see no reason why these won't all grow into lovely strong plants. On your bed. Oh gosh, this is starting to rain, so this is a nice indoor job. Ironically, because actually it involves wetting hydrangeas to dry them. Because although it's about drying them, they really require a lot of water for that process. And that is because these flower heads, which look so magnificent at this time of year, are not flower heads really, but actually bracts. So all of these, what look like petals, are more closely related to leaves. And that means that they have the ability, like leaves, to open their pores and directly soak up water. And if you soak them and allow them to be filled with moisture, it means they will dry better, holding their colour and holding their structure. You can dry them without, but they tend to go a very washed out, pale colour. And drying them is lovely because if you get it right, they'll last for months and months in a vase and make a real statement. So these have been in here overnight, completely submerged. So all I need to do is add them to a vase of water. The whole process with hydrangea flowers requires water. Now normally, when you are drying flowers, you would hang them upside down like that. And that's because they'll keep their form as they're drying so that when you then turn them back, they look correct. Because these aren't flowers, they're bracts, these need water throughout the whole process in order for them to retain their structure. So just stick them in the vase with a freshly cut base and they will keep absorbing moisture. Top up the water all the time until you start to feel those bracts going crispy and see that they're completely dry. Once they are completely dry, they will then last for months, certainly up until Christmas, and they make a really lovely Christmas display. Now, this year, Carol has been encouraging us all to grow plants for free. And autumn is one of the most exciting seasons for that because it's when you collect the seeds for next year's plants.
This year, I've been sharing with you the way I've always gardened, as long as I can remember, by propagating plants for free. Back in the spring, I started by sowing seeds. It's incredible to think that something so tiny, something so insignificant, is actually so powerful and can produce a plethora of wonderful plants. And the seed I sowed didn't disappoint. Cosmos, Ami, and scented sweet peas. By early summer, seedlings moved on to bigger homes, and we delved into free plants from division. But taking cuttings couldn't be simpler. Fuchsias, catmint, and one of my real favourites. Just look at these pelargoniums. Now, my neighbour Molly was kind enough to lend me a plant and I took some cuttings early on, and now they've turned into really substantial little plants. Look at this. Not only is it flowering, but look at that root system. So they're ready to pot on, grow on, and then take even more cuttings from them. Some of the wonderful plants that I've grown for free this year have ended up in this bed. Way back, it was nothing but bare earth. But now, look at it. It's really given me interest right the way through the seasons. But I think it looks great with this wonderful backdrop of rudbeckia glowing in the sunshine. Now, not everybody's lucky enough to have a garden. And with that in mind, earlier on I planted a great big pot full of annuals. It's made me smile every time I've walked past it. Today, it's all about harvest. I'm not talking about my peas, beans and carrots. No, all around the garden, seed heads have been swelling and ripening, and I've been keeping a really, really careful eye on them. Just look at this. It's the perfect day for collecting seeds. It's dry, it's sunny. Just look at this Ami. This is Ami visnaga, isn't it spectacular? The point at which you collect your seed is exactly the point at which Mother Nature would be distributing it. So it's ripe, ready. If I leave this any longer, it'll start dropping its seeds all over the place. So you want to collect them when they're absolutely dry and perfect. Ooh, there's masses of it. When you do go and collect your seed, you really need to be prepared. And I am prepared. Look, I've got my paper bag already. It's a special paper bag too. It's got my granddaughter's picture of a cat, but on the other side, it's also got the name. I've already written it, Ami visnaga. So I'm going to tip these into here. It's really important to use paper. Old paper bags, envelopes, anything like that. Don't use plastic because that makes your seeds sweat. The trouble is with a plant like this, you get greedy. So plenty in there, loads and loads. But what else is there in here? It's really vital to collect your seed when it's ready. And I've been collecting seed for months and months because some things flower early. And of course, as soon as a plant has finished flowering, it wants to make seed. Well, I want more of this lovely scabiosa. It's called ochroleuca, smothered in flowers and already lots of it has set seed. But because it didn't start flowering until late, I don't know that this seed is really quite ready yet. If you take your thumb and run it across the surface, the seeds should fall off if it's ripe, and I'm afraid they're not. I'll just have to wait for this. But there's a few things over there which I think are going to be just ready. It seems a shame to cut some seed pods off because they're so beautiful in their own right. Now this is a kind of honesty, but this is an honesty with a difference. It's perennial. It's called Lunaria rediviva, which simply means it carries on growing, and it'll come up year after year after year. And all I'm going to do, sorry plant, is just snip a few of these off. Look at that. Can you actually see those 3 seeds in there, all in a line, and all protected by this lovely dry, silvery coat? Aren't they gorgeous? Isn't nature wonderful? Ooh, look at these. Oh, aren't they scrumptious? This is one of my favourite campanulas of all time. It's Campanula latifolia, the giant bellflower. Just look how tall it was. And it was smothered in these big blue bells earlier on. But now, all these seed heads are completely dried out and crispy. They're almost sort of crunchy. With most seed pods, the seed would come out at the top. Just think of a poppy. All the seed will come out of the top of the seed pod. But with campanulas, it doesn't. It's got this really crafty mechanism, so it opens up all these little apertures right the way around the back of the seed pod. And with a bit of luck, look at that. Oh, I'll tell you what, just from that one seed pod, I bet you there's at least 100 seeds there. absolutely splendid. Once you start, you can't stop. But I suppose I've got to draw the line somewhere. The robin agrees. Listen to him. Do you think that's enough? Yeah. Now there's a little bit of dross and debris in there, so all I'm going to do is winnow it. So you just blow gently, and any bits of old seed pod just come off and fly away. And you're left with the pure seed, which is what you want. There it goes. Only about 200 more different kinds to go, but I'm longing to do this honesty. So I'm just going to detach this one. Now it looks sort of brown, you can see the seeds inside, but if you just very, very carefully, oh, can you see them? On one side, and then on the other side, 2 more seeds. In fact, 3, because I've left one in the middle. A lot of this seed will be stored until next year, and there are 3 sorts of conditions. The first 2 are imperative. It wants to be cool and it wants to be dry. The 3rd one is optional. It should be in the dark if you can manage that. When do you sow your seed? That's another question. Another quandary. Well, it's not really. If you're sowing something like the cosmos, which is half hardy, it's a bit tender, you've got to store it and then sow it next spring. But on the other hand, this is a hardy perennial, this lunaria. So too is the campanula. So what you could do is store most of it, but try sowing a bit now. You'll probably get twice as many plants as you bargained for, but there's always somebody who'd love those plants. We started with sowing seed, and today we've been collecting it, and we'll be sowing that seed again. It just reminds you of the whole cycle of nature, of which we're all part. And it's not just plants for free, it's the way forward for any gardener who cares about the future of the planet. And it's also so exciting, so thrilling, so wonderful to acknowledge nature and to try and emulate it.
Getting an early sowing in is something I'm trying here with something I've never done before. So in that same vein of experimentation, I am going to grow some peas now. It's not something completely new. People do this. You just have to make sure that you use the right varieties. And this one is called Meteor. It's hardy, so it should be absolutely fine with an autumn sowing. The key is stopping it from growing too much. You want to really slow grow through the winter, and then they should be flowering about a month early next year. Then you do your spring sowing as well, and you have a bit of a succession. This is a very classic method of growing them in a piece of old guttering. So you're basically creating a preset row that when it's all fully rooted can just slide out and go straight into the ground. So I'm just filling it with a peat-free compost. I haven't put holes in it because it's open at the end, so the water should drain through. Right. So I'll just sow the peas along as they'll be spaced in the bed. It's about 5 to 10 centimetres apart and a couple of inches deep in the compost. And these will need to go somewhere that is not too frosty, but not too hot. So here they're probably okay because it's unheated, but you wouldn't want to put them in a heated greenhouse. A cold frame would be fine, but bring them out into the open air wherever you can, because they like the cold. It will slow them down and stop them from getting too leggy too quickly. There we go, that's that done. And I'm also going to sow some sweet peas, which is something that people do all the time. It's very commonly done, an autumn sowing and then again a spring sowing. Now, we have quite unpredictable weather nowadays, so you might find that one or the other fails, but having done both, you'll hopefully still get something. I'm using some newspaper, but I've just rolled up and firmed. I've wetted it so that it holds its shape, and some toilet rolls. and they'll disintegrate, so you can plant them in their little pots, and it's just a nice way of recycling rather than buying new plastic. With these, I will just put probably 2 in each pot. I'd leave these ones outside for the winter. They like it cold, and the cold winter with the rain will soften the hard seed case, because sometimes you need to soak sweet peas to get them to germinate. This compost's actually really moist, so I don't need to water them now, but I'll just keep them fairly moist until they've germinated. It's so lovely in the autumn to feel that you're doing something for spring. The whole winter to get through, but there's a little bit of hope here. Speaking of hope, the weather has cleared up, so I'm going to brave the outdoors. Come on, Roo. There we go. Right, should we go? Go on then. There's nothing quite like having a little bonfire at this time of year when it's cold and a little bit drizzly, especially on the allotment. There's something so lovely about it. I've got this squash which has a really tough skin, so it'll go straight into the embers as it is. But if you had a potato or some peppers, you could wrap them in foil and do exactly the same thing. So once that's cooked, that'll give me plenty of nutrition for a busy weekend ahead in the garden. Most onion sets are planted in the spring, but there are some varieties that can overwinter and give you an earlier crop next year. These can be planted directly outdoors if your soil is fairly free draining. Plant 15 to 20 centimetres apart and just under the surface. Firm the soil well around them and water if dry. If you haven't turned your compost for a while, now is a good time to do it. Chop up any large pieces of material to help it break down faster. Then turn it all over in the container. This will give it oxygen and help the bacteria and worms to speed up decomposition. By next spring, you should have a clean smelling, rich compost. Cucumbers grown inside will be coming to an end now. Harvest any remaining fruits and then untie the vines from their supports. These can be reused again next year. Pull the entire plant and roots out from the soil. The whole lot can be added to your compost. Well, I have a new log on the fire and the squash looks nearly ready. So I reckon I'm all set for the evening. But that's all there's time for today. Monty is back next week at Longmeadow at 8 p.m. But until then, goodbye.